And they used to take my sister and I on they were world travelers. So they would take us on all these really fabulous trips all over the world. And one year, the summer of 2002, we were supposed to go to England, London, England with them. But that September before, September 2001, when they were planning the trip, is obviously when the World Trade Center attacks happened. And they decided, it might be safer if we don't go abroad, because we have no idea what's going to happen. So they invited my sister and I was in college at the time, and they invited us to just visit them in Salisbury, which we were happy to do. We loved spending time with them. And when we went to visit, my grandmother said, we're getting in the car, we're driving to the coast, 45 minutes to the coast, and I'm going to take you to Smith Island, which is this island I had never heard of. Are you familiar with it? Your parents being from?
A little bit.
Yeah, so it's this really 9 square mile strip of land, 45-minute ferry ride from the coast. You can only get there by boat. And at the time that we went, there were 500 people that lived there. And they're famous for their cake, the Smith Island cake, which is a 10 to 12 layer, chocolate iced decadent dessert. So they took us there. I was 21, 22 at the time. And I had been all over the world at this point, thanks to them. And this was the most fascinating place I had ever stepped foot. Because these people, it was like they had their own language, their own accent. They all lived in this town. They all definitely knew each other. The 500 of them, a lot of them were generations of family had been there. There was one school, there was a post office, there was no alcohol on the island. To get groceries, you had to take a boat to the mainland just to get chips and stuff. And it was just fascinating to me. And I think even in my little, burgeoning novelist brain, I knew that it would be an amazing setting for a story. And so for The Invisible Husband, I fictionalized it, but Frick Island is essentially Smith Island. I think it's the loneliness, and then it's also her working through her grief. And I definitely have to put myself in those situations as I'm writing those scenes. So, it's sometimes alarming to my husband when I come out of my office and I'm crying and he's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, oh, it's the characters. But yeah, I certainly put myself through those emotions because, again, just like in writing an essay, if you're not being vulnerable or you're not feeling it, then it's not going to come across on the page. Proximity is super important in love stories, so hence the very small town. But then also just, again, creating that connection. I don't know if I'm good at explaining how to do it. I just know when I've done it, if that makes sense. And again, it takes a lot of drafting and a lot of tries and a lot of scenes that get written and get thrown out until I have nailed that bond or that connection between my two main characters. But it's interesting with Frick, I thought that I was writing a love story between two people and almost a love triangle, even though one of them happens to be not alive. But what that book really ended up being to me is a love story about a community and the love that a community has for this girl and that they have for each other. And then that they come to have for an outsider, because I think in our society right now, we have a big issue with outsiders. And so I just really kind of wanted to write a book about hope and about how we're all so much more alike than we are different. Even if we have delusions that our husband is alive and our dead husband's alive and sitting right there, you can still find connection and something in common with people that you might not agree with. Even though this book is also pretty outlandish, it's actually one of my most personal books, I think, that I've ever written because the character Louise is greatly based on my grandmother, Marion Oakley, who I was incredibly close with, the one who would take my sister and I world traveling. She and I, as I became an adult, we spoke on the phone 2-3 times a week. We would take our own solo road trips together, loved spending time together. And about 5 years before she passed, she was diagnosed with late onset Parkinson's disease, which is a really tough condition for many, many reasons. But one of them is the concoction of drugs that they kind of put you on to deal with the symptoms often creates major hallucinations and very vivid dreams that feel very real, and it's hard to differentiate, reality from fiction. And so my grandmother on the phone started to say some really kind of outlandish things. One time she said, we were talking and she said, Colleen, did you send that check for $10,000 to New Jersey? And I said, no, what check and what for? And she said, well, to pay off my gambling debts. And so she started to, just many, many examples, just like that, just as outlandish. And so I started to think, what if my grandmother had lived this other secret life that nobody in the family knew about, and it was all starting to come out, toward the end of her life. And that's when the character of Louise was born, who has this very big secret that nobody in her family knows about. And it ends up sending her on a cross-country road trip on the lam from the police with her 21-year-old caretaker. Well, what's funny is my husband and I had taken, I have 4 kids, and we took them on a road trip to Denver to see family, I think about 4 years ago. And so we did half of the route that Tanner and Louise go on, because they're driving from Atlanta to California. And so I was able to be familiar with a lot of the places they stopped and the landmarks, which was great fun. But I think I've always wanted to write a road trip book. I love road trip movies. I love road trip books. I just think they're so fun. Of course, one of the great inspirations is Thelma and Louise, in case you can't tell from the title. And so it was just really great fun to kind of pay homage to that amazing movie and finally get to write my own road trip book.